Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. The cultural theorist Mark Fisher, author of Capitalist Realism and the K-Punk blog, has become a cult figure in the world of the online left. So much so that his work and Fisher himself have become the stuff of memes. The memeing of Mark Fisher is the subject of a new book by Mike Watson. Watson picks up on Fisher's recognition that capitalism breeds depression at a moment when the lockdown pandemic world is in the throes of an economic and psychological depression, no doubt exacerbated by the wholesale transfer of life and culture online. Alongside Fisher, Mike Watson's book revisits the Frankfurt School theorists who worked during the rise of the culture industry. In examining their thoughts and drawing parallels with Fisher's capitalist realism, Watson aims to render the Frankfurt School as an incisive theoretical toolbox for the post-COVID digital age. Mike Watson is a theorist, critic, and curator who is principally focused on the relationship between culture, new media, and politics. I'm very happy that Mike joins me now to talk about the legacy of Mark Fisher, meme warfare, and the future of the acid left. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Hey, hi. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Mike, we're going to be talking about your new book, The Memeing of Mark Fisher, which follows on quite neatly, I think, from a previous book entitled Can the Left Learn to Meme? So it's no doubt to me straight away that we're talking about the left, we're talking about political project, and we're talking about memes. But before we get into any of this, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you came to be, well, one, a leftist, two, how you came to be interested in memes, and how the intellectual sphere around all of this has developed.
Okay, right. Yeah. The question how I came to be a leftist is a bit like one that someone asked me recently on a podcast, was how I came to be interested in art, not because they're the same, not, it's not the same reason, but it's just something that,
I mean, I also want you to answer that question if you can.
well, maybe I can work them together. But the reason that I find the question similar is that it's just so hard to trace the, the originary moment when I became a leftist. I didn't have like Paul on the road to Damascus moment. Well, I suppose at some point in my teens anyway, that I started to identify with anarchism and Marxism equally, and sometimes alternately. And I think I'm someone who really thinks it's important to maintain this term, the left. Equally, terms like socialism. There's a growing trend to say that we're beyond left and right. I don't really buy that, because the left means something very specific. I mean, you could call it something different from the left, but we tend to say left. So I think, we all know what we're talking about when we say left. But for me, it's really summed up by this quote from Marx: from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs, which basically is a process of sharing, but some kind of process whereby you share out according to what people need to fulfill their potential, which is very important to me growing up, because we had no money. I grew up in the UK where I was born, and we were pretty poor. Went to a state school. There were 5 children in the family, and my dad was frequently unemployed or self-employed gardener, decorator. But we had no money, and I think that impedes one. And my parents really said, look, you have to get an education, you need to do your studies, and I happen to be good at my studies, so they push that and they push that. And it just always seemed to me, therefore, fundamental that we do give everyone the opportunities, because we don't know where the next great opera singer or painter or politician might come from, if everyone had the possibility to learn and to explore what they're good at. So that's really, for me, the main thing. And yeah, it's just been since I was in my teens. And then art, at some point I just felt that art is fundamental also to this. And that was before I even knew about the Frankfurt School, who we'll discuss shortly, who I wrote about in those 2 books you mentioned. But just that art maybe is a missing piece in all of this, that Marxist materialism is not enough. And yeah, I'm still grappling with that today.
You're not alone in trying to figure these things out. And I ask you about your leftism, I think quite facetiously, but I think it's an important distinction to make in a podcast network where we generally talk to scholars who are engaged in various guises of the humanities and critical theories. I think it's important to underline that some of your interests come from a field of political practice. I think one of the things we need to get out of the way before we get into the meaning of Mark Fisher is a tiny biography or intellectual biography of Mark Fisher. Who was Mark Fisher, and why are his ideas worthy of a revival so soon after they've actually come into being in the first place?
Okay, yeah, Mark Fisher is a British critical theorist, and he studied, I think, in the 90s. He did his PhD at Warwick University in a department that had attached somehow a research centre. I forget the name actually. I'm
You're
not
talking about the
very.
CCRU,
Yes, yeah, which doesn't
yeah?
actually, if you look up Nick Land, doesn't tell you anything good about Mark Fisher, but just to say that he was part of a
No.
group of people who went on to be very influential, who all went to Warwick, such as Ray Brassier, also went to Warwick. He went from Warwick, didn't find university post, and ended up also not getting published very much, and then started a blog called K-Punk in the early 2000s, and that became hugely influential. It was part of like a massive moment of positivity for the internet. I think Mark Fisher was, I think he was probably equally positive and negative, but
Hmm.
it was a moment where we thought the internet could really lead, revolutions, but also revolutions in publishing and in academia, and it kind of did the latter to some degree. And Fisher then got a part-time post at Goldsmiths University after teaching in further education. So, like in America, you'd say, what would you say, high school, but in the UK, you say
Hmm.
college. So he was teaching there in high school or college for a while, then did get a kind of part-time temporary post at Goldsmiths, and then got I think actually a solid proper post, at Goldsmiths College. And then tragically, when this was all going so well for him, after he'd also published a book called Capitalist Realism with an imprint called Zero Books, which he set up with a few friends of his, after kind of getting that stable position and that success through Capitalist Realism, he took his life in 2017.
Hmm.
So since then, he's just become huge. I mean, he was already, I think, one of the biggest living critical theorists in the UK, or should we say philosophers of culture in the UK, was getting a growing audience in Europe, was starting to make tiny inroads in America. And I think the thing that really stuck is he was talking about capitalism and the way capitalism co-ops culture. So it's kind of big idea on capitalist realism, which isn't entirely new, which he stated brilliantly and in a way that I think British people, of the time, 2008, 2009, could understand. The thing that he said is that basically there's not an idea that exists or a cultural tendency or movement that isn't co-opted immediately by
Mm.
capitalism, and he was dealing with what we then do about that, and he called that reality capitalist realism. Okay, so that term stuck, and he was brilliant at coming up with terms actually, and that term really stuck, and it's kind of defined the theoretical period, but it defined the theoretical period, you know, after he wrote the book, but since he died, it's exploded. But what's
Hmm.
also happened is he's become a meme. He's become a popular meme figure that is an image, his own image, or quotes from his books, or the image of the cover of Capitalist Realism has become like, part of many memes, and memes being kind of viral JPEG or video images that spread around the internet. So when we say meme, we basically mean a viral cultural unit. But when we
Hmm.
say meme in this context, we often mean literally these often square JPEG images that appear on your social media feed. So he's been, for me, memed because he's become a meme. And then the thing about this is it basically means he's become co-opted. He has become co-opted by capital, just like he warned that everything, even the most kind of
Yeah.
virulent anti-capitalist, statement will become co-opted by capital. And you could ask, well, why does that mean he's been co-opted by capital? Because memes don't make money as
Mm.
such. They're not part of like the exchange of artworks, for example, or mostly not in the art world. But they do feed into the data capitalist structure, because everything you do online creates data, which then gets sold. So that's what my book, The Memeing of Mark Fisher, is about. Is about how he became memed, and if even he can't resist, or his image can't resist capitalism, what can? But then I looked at the Frankfurt School, because they first, or for me, they first brought up. Well, I mean, it really, I think, goes back to Marx and George Lukács. But in terms of prominent philosophical figures, they're the ones associated most with this idea of cooptation
Yeah.
of culture, and they had their own ways of dealing with this. So I kind of talk about their ways of dealing with it, because actually Fisher leaves a cryptic message at the end of Capitalist Realism when he says that capitalism causes depression. And he says at the end of the book, we need to basically take this depression and kind of use it against capitalism. So he kind of suggests that it's something about this depressive malaise caused by capitalism that could lead to new cultural thoughts and movements. But it's like very much in the last 2 pages. But in his last unfinished work, which is called Acid Communism, the introduction of which is published in an anthology of writings of his, in his last unfinished work, he develops much more on the notion that not just mental illness, but kind of irrational thought processes and irrational creative forms could be part of an anti-capitalist movement, which he would tie into the countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s. So I basically pick up on that and talk about how he relates to the Frankfurt School of thinkers from capitalist realism up to his last unfinished work, again, Acid Communism.
Thank you. I'm going to leave links to a variety of sources, including all the books that we just mentioned, Mike, so that listeners can peruse the K-Punk archive as well as immerse themselves in the variety of Fisher memes that I think we'll be talking about in one way or another in a moment. But before we get into this mimetic reproduction, I think we should do what you try to do in the book, which is to start with the legacy of the Frankfurt School and their approaches to this moment that Fisher recognized, this moment of absolute cooptation. So the different thinkers in the Frankfurt School, I think, have the different responses to that moment of doom, so to speak. So Adorno has this idea of return to abstraction in the culture industries. Horkheimer is into philosophy. Marcuse is, I guess, interested in human sexuality and eros. And I guess the thinker who's most straightforwardly connection to internet cultures is Walter Benjamin.
Okay, so Benjamin is probably best known for his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which he wrote in the 1930s. Basically, in that essay, he talks about how there was a huge increase in the production of images in the early modern period, or shall we say, the kind of mass reproduction of images in the era of industrial capitalism led to a proliferation of images such that people could experience artworks for the first time. People who couldn't see the Mona Lisa firsthand could now see it in books or on postcards, on posters, biscuit tins, etc. And he said that this had 2 effects. Firstly, it kind of took away what he called the aura, which is kind of a non-spiritual, or should we say quasi-spiritual glow around the artwork. Not that you could see, but kind of an imagined glow, making the artwork somehow different to other ordinary objects. It took away the aura from the artwork, and at the same time it made the artwork more accessible to the masses, thus democratizing culture. So these are 2 contrary trends. But what Benjamin says is that, okay, whilst we lose the individual aura of the artwork, the thing that makes an individual specific art object like the Mona Lisa alluring, whilst we strip that away to some degree, both in the reproductions of the Mona Lisa, because they don't have that same, that aura attached to the object's uniqueness, both in the individual original artwork and in the copies. Okay, the copies don't have what the Mona Lisa has. The Mona Lisa no longer has what the Mona Lisa used to have, because we've already seen it many times before we get to finally see it. And when we see it, it's surrounded by other tourists trying to get photos of it. Then what he says is that aside from this kind of loss of the aura, you do have a situation where the public, seeing many, many more things, seeing many more images, suddenly want more stuff. They want increased wealth, basically. But suddenly they had, the images they were seeing in magazines, in cinemas, on posters, etc. And this led them to question material relations and why they perhaps couldn't have this stuff in reality. Okay, so what the fascists did at that point, what right-wingers basically did, is take people's hunger for more things and divert it into a hunger for expansionism, for warfare, for living space in the East, for example. This was very effective. Okay, so what I would say is that today's image culture around Instagram, Facebook, Twitch, so that's a live streaming service, YouTube, that does this, but to a much greater degree. It basically repeats Adorno's process, but we're suddenly dealing with a situation when not only do we see so much more stuff, we also have dangled in front of us the prospect of becoming a star, either deliberately or even accidentally becoming famous. Also because people can make so many decisions in their everyday life in terms of what they see, or they think they can at least. This leads people to want to make political decisions. So you get things like Trump saying, let's build a wall. That sounds proactive. We're doing something. We're going to build a wall. Or you have Boris Johnson saying, let's take back control from the EU. Okay, so these things were very effective. And they very much tied in with the public, really asking, well, why can't we be making decisions? Why do we feel somehow spoken down to? There's a flip side to this, though, because actually these new kind of media do more than ever actually allow us to get access to the stuff that we crave, to have the celebrity that we crave. So you have a process that's much similar to in Walter Benjamin's time in the 1930s, but that is also different. And I think that's something very important to grasp, because I think media theory is too reliant on this kind of top-down Marxist, this Marxist pyramid, whereby the ruling elite control the media to dominate the masses. Well, they do, but you have a situation where the masses now are able to make their own media, and then this necessitates a new type of confusion of the messages coming from the elite, because they just basically they're embracing the lack of a one-directional narrative, and they're feeding into the confusion to create a smokescreen behind which they can carry on their control. So this leaves us with a situation, where the internet is, in a sense, both the best and worst thing that ever happened to us, because it does give us power, but it also enables a total smokescreen created by the people who have the real power. And the book kind of interacts with these themes and asks, what do we do next? Now, Walter Benjamin, aside from saying all of that stuff, he also talked about constellations. So actually, it's important to realize that the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction was written whilst he was also writing what we call the Arcades Project, which was a project whereby he walked around the arcades of Paris, these covered shopping malls, which were built in the 1800s. He walked around them like a flâneur, who were people of the 1800s who bourgeois people who would kind of dress up and just walk very casually and slowly around Paris, almost as a protest. Almost, they were like slackers. How can we say it? Or mall rats. Mall rats being like American kids who hang around malls. They were like that, but rich. And I mean, really trying to fathom their motivations is difficult. But in the book, I kind of say, well, it's almost a protest against their own wealth, against the absurdity of the industrial period in Paris, whereby the children of the bourgeois had so much money and time that they would just walk around parading their riches through their clothes, almost as nihilistic, an affirmation of the absurdity of the position they inhabited as wealthy people. Now, Benjamin reflected back on that. He was also a bourgeois son of German Jewish industrialists, who was exiled from Germany during World War II. And he kind of reflected back from that. And I think what he was doing was he was reenacting being a flâneur as a kind of admission of his own privilege. And also, when he was going on his slow walking tours of the arcades of Paris, he was trying to put together what he called constellations. So this is part of his theory, the constellation, but he was kind of actively dealing with constellations. Now, constellations for Benjamin are groups of objects that you put together, and in grouping them together, you start to create new interpretations from that grouping that maybe is different from the individual objects in themselves. So you may have a book and a magazine and a bar of luxury soap and a piece of jewelry, and then you can juxtapose that with the actual building they're sold in. So Benjamin walked through these arcades that had these kind of boutique shops, and he would create juxtapositions in his mind together with juxtapositions of the things he was reading, such as Marx and who wrote Flowers of Evil.
Baudelaire.
Yeah. And a number of other people he was reading as he was researching the Arcades project. And in putting together these constellations of the objects he was seeing and the architecture that was itself built in the 1800s, this kind of booming industry in France. As he was putting together these things, he hoped that constellations of capitalist products could throw light on the history of capitalism and explain how he got where he was then, or how society got where it was then. So it's a way of basically almost excavating capitalism, taking it out of sequence and throwing together disparate objects with a view to better understanding capitalism from the results. Now, I was just saying all that to say that bear in mind that the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction was written whilst he was also writing that much longer book, The Arcades Project. Now, where he's referring to media there, I think he's doing that because he hopes to interpret through the media of the time, the contemporary media of the time. He hopes to also interpret the history of capitalism leading up to then. So, rather than talking about constellations of capitalist commodities in a normal sense, in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, he's exploring constellations of image objects, of media.
Should we try to drag Benjamin into the digital age? Because you have a not very nice title. You compare Benjamin to the digital flaneur in one of your chapters, and you pick up on something that Mark Fisher observes in one of his essays, which is that the amount of preparation that goes into the Instagram selfie, or whichever platform Fisher would have been referring to, is indicative of the fact, and I think this is now your observation, that the amount of labor that goes into this kind of appearance of nonchalance and spontaneity that we all produce on the internet is to do with the fact that we are somehow free to do that, as in we're not required to participate in other forms of labor. The traditional Marxist conception of what it is that labor means is now so completely out of sync with reality that we do ourselves a bit of a disservice by clinging on to these kind of ideas. So from that perspective, the meme maker or the selfie taker is still this kind of Benjaminian flaneur. How do you see that reading from Benjamin being something that we can use productively as a political set of directives for the internet age?
So where the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction enters into this process of constellations, but where he's suggesting the possibility of looking at constellations of media in terms of film, magazine, etc. I think we can do that today because I think we are much like flaneurs in our behaviour. Not possibly that we are as privileged as flaneurs, but then this is very tricky because if you're looking at a world categorizations of privilege that include not only all of history but include the whole world, then I'd have to say that even the fairly poor among us in the West are fairly privileged. And of course, there's degrees of that because there's certain mechanisms. There's mechanisms of capital in the West that mean you can be fairly privileged, but you're still somehow impeded in becoming an individuated person, or however you want to put it. But I think one can be privileged and not privileged at the same time. But in any case, let's say I never had much money myself, and my family, was poor when I grew up. But in my spending most of my day on the internet, as a writer, but also making memes, looking at internet culture, watching Netflix, whatever, I am enormously privileged in comparison to so many people in the world who don't have that flexibility, who don't have the opportunity just to meander. So, even the process by which we go through the internet, by which we look at things, by which we pick up and put down things, so to speak, is a lot like the way a flaneur walked through Paris. So I make that comparison, and I think that we do put together constellations non-stop, and I think a lot of the constellations we put together, they really surprise us, they shock us, and I think that they do reveal to some degree to us the absurdity of capitalism. But I think we often get kind of stuck there, that we see absurdity, and what's actually happening, which I don't say in the book really, is that we cycle through constellations of absurd image objects on the internet, and we realize how ridiculous this all is, and I think we get cynical, but we just go back into the same cycle. We don't tend to do much about it. And then if you look at the meme production of young people, let's say Generation Z, so they would be up to mid-20s, I guess, millennials as well, but they can be anything up to, I guess, 41 or so now.
No, please
But
don't say 41, because I'm 41. I am definitely not a millennial. 40 is the cutoff point
is it?
officially. On my podcast, it's 40. I'm sorry.
All right, okay. I'm not going to argue. I mean, you can't be 40 forever, because that's the whole thing about generations. It was 40 millennial. Anyway, younger people, let's say people who were in their 20s, in their 30s, up to a certain point. The production they're putting out there, the images they're putting out there, are deeply cynical often, and I think this is where Mark Fisher's been picked up on as a figure, as a kind of meme image, because his message is is that basically we can't supersede capitalism probably, but he does leave this kind of get out point, but it's lost in a lot of the memes. A lot of the memes just refer to his cynicism, because it chimes with the cynicism and anger and bitterness of young people today. I think the internet can be useful if we make these constellations, if we bring them to a certain point, having reached realizations about capitalism, and we then get together and we try and do something about it. We have to use the internet to get us, to meet up outside the internet. But that's not, it's not to say I don't dislike the internet. I think it's really can be very useful. But I wrote this book in lockdown. Anyway, I found the lockdown a very heavy moment. And my feeling was that the lockdown certainly expedited our kind of, being permanently online, so that everyone ended up in this space, because people ended up doing, working through Zoom, who maybe weren't familiar, with that kind of technology before. And I was thinking, well, we're actually going to this is going to have to end one day. And when it ends, there's going to be, a desire to change things. But at the same time, I think we're going to be quite stuck in this internet. I had kind of foreseen a possible kind of an emergence of a countercultural movement similar to that which was engaged with by Herbert Marcuse, who's also a Frankfurt School figure, who I talk about there. And that Fisher points to as well in his unfinished book Acid Communism, where he quotes Marcuse. And I really thought that maybe this is the moment for a counterculture, because you have a situation where a number of people who would have normally kind of experimented with drugs and sexuality, and actually just had their first moments of socializing as adults, completely independent from their families. A number of people who would have had that experience and who were denied it because of the COVID lockdown would have suddenly been allowed out, at the same time as a number of unemployed persons, because the economy was presumably going to crash, would suddenly be out on the streets. And there would be potential for the kind of movement Marcuse proposed, whereby the students would kind of meet up with the migrant class, meeting up with workers, and they would engage in what Marcuse called the Great Refusal, which was simply a refusal of the way that capitalist culture co-opted to desire in his case. So Marcuse talks about this kind of same process that Fisher talked about, but more in terms of how capitalist culture sells us our desires, but kind of watered down. So we're sold solutions to our desires through Hollywood films that
Yeah.
don't entirely actually that actually, they lead us to think we've been satiated whilst actually our desires have become something else. Marcuse says we need to kind of rise up against this, and saw that as happening as he saw a kind of freeing up of sexual energies in the 60s.
I think maybe it's a good moment for us to get a little bit more in line than we have so far in our conversation. And being online, I guess, is a technical term that we might have to explain to our listeners. There is an aspect of participation in Tumblr, Twitch, and Twitter discourses that means that one is completely isolated from reality. I see your book trying to engage with meme culture in a slightly different way than you did in Can the Learn Left to Meme, or at least you see this kind of new optimism. So you have a really beautiful observation right at the beginning, when you say that lockdowns and working from home have turned us all into exactly the same class because we're going nowhere. There's everything can remain aspirational, but the aspiration is always to click like on something. So when we all reduce to our beings on the internet, we sort of equalized. And I think that's a point from which you see the meme, the memeing of Fisher, and actually the memeing of everything else as having political potential. So I think before we get into what you think the left could be doing, it might be a good idea to spend a moment to describe the meme landscape of the political right. And of course, this is a massive question because the political right means many different things. But I'm interested in the background against which any kind of cultural and therefore counter-political narrative can emerge.
Okay, but firstly about right-wing memes, not to go into too much the specifics, but I suppose the most shocking thing, the thing that really made people pay attention to right-wing memes, was their reclaiming of Nazi symbolism and the way in which they openly laughed at anti-Semitism and otherwise displayed racist views and imagery. Just the ripping up, the complete trashing of certain things we held to be beyond reproach. I think that basically happened because I think that, well, I mean, it's almost a South Park moment. It was, I mean, the thing is, it had already been happening. That's the thing. It was like it had been happening in mainstream culture. There was this kind of extreme irony, and you had to ask, was this extreme irony, which was basically, it was often aimed at the bigots themselves. So if you take a cartoon like South Park, you had a situation where you would have these racist jokes, but it would be like, but the joke's being made by racists, and therefore, we're supposed to be laughing at the racism of the character, as well as perhaps laughing at the shrill kind of aspect of political correctness, but simultaneously laughing at a political correctness that perhaps had become too much taken for granted, and laughing at ignorance at the same time. The tricky thing became that in a culture that basically, where the country was very much dominated by white heterosexual men, could you really say that, it's a joke to ironically laugh at the bigotry, of opinions coming from, that quarter, from those people? I don't think it's an irony when you still haven't resolved the fundamental problems and tensions. So if you get to meme culture, I think that's basically, that's just people taking on those kind of messages and doing it for themselves. So it's no longer coming through South Park; it was coming just through kids, in their bedrooms. Well, the kids, a lot of the time, I think the thing is they were just joking, because they kind of realized, hey, we can post this Nazi comment and people are going to get really upset. So I think it was a kind of provocation, a bit like South Park. And I think it was, if it wasn't a joke against racism itself, it was a joke against just everyone. It was a joke against the whole system, which was a mess, in which they could see in their own parents, their teachers, everyone around them, was presenting this one face of, a civilized society that would not condone the swastika, for example, as a red line, but at the same time, you had this level of police brutality as well. You have ongoing in America. It was the unwitting emergence into the mainstream of the reality of bigotry in America and the way that the neoliberal order defended that bigotry. And you could say the same, therefore, for the whole of the Western world. And then how does one react to that? Well, that's tricky. I mean, because you're reacting against the people making the memes isn't really any good. It doesn't really work because, like I say, I think that they are. We're all kind of mouthpieces for culture. I don't think it's particularly their fault. There's a lot of talk about protecting the rights of minorities, of women, LGBTQ, and then there are, down on their luck, white men saying, "What about me?" So I think that it's not so surprising that this kind of bigotry manifested in that way, that people will become carriers of those messages that were really messages that just reflected the fundamental inequality of neoliberal culture. So what I would say is that one way that we have tried to react to it on the left is to make memes with the hammer and the sickle, memes with Stalin. There's been a direct reaction. Okay, so they reclaim the swastika, we reclaim Sovietism, Soviet imagery, but that doesn't work for me. And I think fundamentally, oppositional messages don't work. And this goes back to another Frankfurt School thinker, Adorno, who I mentioned in Can Left Learn to Meme and the Memeing of Mark Fisher. So Adorno basically believed that you couldn't really oppose barbarity. He was a German Jew who fled Nazi Germany, like Marcuse did, and Walter Benjamin as well. Adorno basically said that figurative art, he specifically meant figurative art in relation to politics, that couldn't address the horrors of World War II. He most famously spoke about poetry when he said it's barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz, and I think meaning poetry fundamentally about Auschwitz. And he said, and this highlights why it's fundamentally barbaric to write any poetry. So what he really meant there is that art about suffering feeds back into that suffering. That was one of his main concerns. But he also says that, look, if we got to a position where the Holocaust can happen, where the gas chambers can happen, we must be so far along the road to complete objectification and commodification of all things, including humans, that it must be possible to make anything called art, anything, because art for him is something that can at least pretend to be other than the world, to have a transcendental capacity. The point is, he's not simply saying, oh no, we can't have poetry about Auschwitz because it's so terrible. He's saying in a society that's so terrible, you can't have poetry. So the artwork for Adorno, when it's really an artwork, it must be free of tension. It must be able to stand above the false binaries of human interaction, temporarily at least. Now, this is maybe important to grasp one thing, so I will say it, is that Adorno says that a fundamental problem is that we as humans constantly identify, and that's part of what he calls identity thinking. And by that, he means that we proceed through life by categorizing things, naming things, giving them numbers, etc., which is essential. We can't live without doing that. It's part of making us safe. Okay, it's part of understanding the world. But he says that basically what's happened is that we've come so far in identifying and categorizing that we've identified and categorized everything to the degree that we've identified and categorized each other under numerical wage values. So we're all worth, something. It's out of this that for Adorno the Holocaust arises. Okay, for Adorno the artwork is removed from this situation, or removes itself from this situation when it's at its most abstract, because in an abstract artwork, and it's easy to think about painting here, although he was talking more about literature and music. But if you think about an abstract painting, you can't say when you look at abstract painting, here's a tree, here's a house, here's a person, etc. For a moment, you're not in a position anymore when confronted by an abstract work that you lose yourself in. If you have the space around you to really contemplate the work, for a moment you're unable to name things, to categorize, to think, I have an appointment at 6 p.m. or I have homework to do if you're a student, or or whatever. You're temporarily removed from that, and you drift away, and at some point that ends, and you feel it ending strongly. You feel yourself come back into your body. Now, Adorno says that's really important because coming back into your body is actually the false moment when you make the distinction between yourself and things around you, which is our biggest kind of problem as humans, that we have to get by, distinguish between myself, the individual I, and everything outside me. But it leads to conflict. So only in this moment of loss in the abstract artwork do you get beyond that conflict. Do you momentarily realize your connectedness to everything around you? Okay, so if you could do this permanently, there wouldn't be any conflict. But it's something that we can only experience fleetingly. For Adorno, you can't make art after Auschwitz because in a society where clearly we're so far in this process of identification of each other that we end up killing people en masse. If that is the case, then there can't be the conditions to create a truly abstract artwork. The two things can't coexist in the same culture, is what Adorno is really saying. Now, the thing is, Adorno was speaking after World War II. Again, he was exiled to Britain, then the US. Horkheimer, his colleague, and Marcuse and Benjamin, all had to flee Nazi Germany. Benjamin went to France. Obviously, we were talking about earlier how he was going around the arcades of Paris as part of his arcades project. Later on, Adorno returned to Germany to carry on the work of the Frankfurt School there. Following World War II, both when he was in the US and after he returned to Germany, he's dealing with what happened as a German Jew who lost people close to him. So Adorno's reacting to, this situation, and he's very negative about any possibility after that of superseding the kind of inherent conflictual nature of human interaction. So he even tells his own students they shouldn't be protesting. So in the late 60s, there's this famous moment where his students rose up against him in Frankfurt, in the university there. And he basically called the cops in January of 1969. He called the police in January 69 on his students. And this is a very famous moment. And actually Adorno, he gets kind of dragged through the mud for this. But he's really thinking, look, until we've resolved the fundamental problem of identity thinking, that we have this tendency to categorize, until we can think otherwise, we're going to keep repeating the same mistakes of the Nazis, but also, of course, of the Soviet Russians, because it was apparent by that point what was happening in Soviet Russia and what had happened under Stalin, the gulags, etc. So he's saying until we resolve this, any movement is going to descend back into tyranny. So I think when we think about how extreme he was in that sense, I think his kind of prohibition on figurative art, anti-war art, it gets put in context. I don't think we're in the same situation now, and I think we have to make our own decisions anyway. I think certainly abstract art could be useful, and I think he's right there. And I think an abstract, output on the internet, an abstract art form on the internet, might help us to kind of get beyond some of these conflicts where you have swastikas as opposed to hammer and sickles, where you have, actually identity politics, which is interesting because, Adorno used this word identity thinking. It's not actually related to identity politics at all.
No.
But you do get with identity politics this strong desire to claim identities. The politics revolves around that rather than revolving around the economy, for example. And it does lead to conflict. We don't want to get into this probably, but council culture, etc. So if we had an abstract internet where instead of it being about like I believe this, no I believe this, and leading to constant binary oppositions on Twitter, for example, if we had something we could contemplate instead, then I think we'd be in a much better position. But what that would be, I don't know. That's difficult because the internet doesn't lend itself to contemplation.
Well, but it lends itself to something, and I mean, you cite plenty of examples in the book where the meme does do quite a lot of this work, and you also you actually come up with a bit of a proposal for how it is that we could try to conduct this kind of open culture through what you term as a slow meme movement. I'm interested in your takes on a couple of things. So first, one of the things that we inherit from Benjamin is the relationship between the left and right of politics and how that determines the relationship between aesthetics and politics. So Benjamin I forget where he does this, but it's something that kind of knocks around all the time, is that he just says that the Nazis politicize aesthetics. So this idea that we leave beautiful ruins behind us. It means that we can make buildings and they are automatically political. That is something that only the right can really deal with. And then the flip side of that is that for the left, the only thing available is to politicize aesthetics, which is possibly why we've had such an explosion, maybe over the period of the last 10, 15 years, of critical political art. And I find that particularly problematic. And I think you have some proposals in the book for how to undo that. I also wanted to ask you about the kind of perversely non-contemplative but also democratic dimension of the meme. So just being purely mechanistic, if we take 4chan or 8chan, those websites which are essentially troll farms in which people throw out ideas, throw out one version after another of the same kind of template, one meme after another with just a couple of words changed or maybe colors different. The way that these seem to circulate is that they're only successful if a certain number of people give them a thumbs up. So there's something vaguely democratic about the successful meme, particularly the right wing meme. So I'm also interested, kind of as a counterpoint to that Benjaminian fix that we are in, is there an element of the left meme that's somehow the opposite of democratic? Like, how do we go about designing a meme? Isn't designing a meme, which is one of the things that you propose for leftist politics, isn't that almost antithetical to what a meme is and how it comes about?
To get into this thing of democracy, I mean, it's a very interesting question. And I think it does come in a bit to Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. You know, democracy is it's something we talk about all the time in terms of culture. I mean, it's part
Yeah.
of every museum's mission statement. It's part of the mission statement of all of the social democracies and neoliberal democracies in the world. You know, all of the culture ministries, they talk about culture
Hmm.
for all. And this really comes down from the avant-garde of the
Yeah.
early last century. You know, this idea that perhaps anyone can do art, coming down from the idea that anything can be art. So Duchamp, Joseph Beuys, etc. You know, you have all of this, but actually, if you go into art spaces, they don't feel very welcoming. You know, museums don't feel very welcoming. Certainly, if you get into actually trying to be part of the art scene, going to galleries when they have openings. But you know, these things, they feel like there's a social code there that somehow you don't often feel you're completely welcome in those events, even if you do have a role to play in the art world. I think, you know, that we've been looking for this kind of ostensibly looking for this kind of open art world where everyone's invited, but actually hasn't really ever existed. And then we finally get it in the shape of
Hmm.
memes, and we start saying no, but don't do that. You know, suddenly you get a thing where anyone can do anything, and you're like, okay, you know, democracy, but hang on, it's the wrong kind of democracy, because look at what the kids are making. You know, so I think we
Yeah.
have this kind of quandary. Benjamin, aesthetics versus politics. Does it come into the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction right at the
I
end?
think so.
I really would be useful to find the very end of that essay. So basically, it does talk about fascism aestheticizing art, and then the last line
Yeah.
says communism responds by politicizing art. Okay,
Hmm.
so that's a distinction. But this is interesting because I know that it didn't say communism. In some versions, it doesn't say communism. And that was changed. If you get most versions of that book, you'll find it doesn't say communism. It says something like similar to like progressive forces. Anyway, so there it's very clear. So that essay, which is often sold as like a nice little essay about how the artwork loses its aura in the age of mass reproduction, is actually an essay about how fascists, you know, use the artwork or use kind of aesthetics to kind of mislead the public. And then it says at the end that the antidote would be communism, which will respond by politicizing art. So that is a distinction there between the aestheticization, which is like the aestheticization of politics, which is basically using, you know, parades, propaganda posters, etc., to basically confuse the public and sidetrack the public from its newfound thirst for more wealth and for at least equal material relations. How can we say it? Material relations that are fair. The Nazis used propaganda to divert from that. So that is the aestheticization of politics. And then Benjamin's response is that we need to respond by politicizing art. So we need to use this moment in which images have this kind of much wider proliferation, in which everyone is able to now appreciate culture and politicize that culture with the knowledge that
I contend that that has proven itself to be a bit of a failure. We shoot ourselves in the foot by doing that. And my primary piece of evidence for that is the entirety of the art world, the critical progressive art world over the last 20 years. And I'll be surprised if you disagreed with that reading. So I'm interested in your reading of that in the internet, in the meme sphere.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, yeah, for sure, the art world, which has had a very political moment since the economic crisis. That's when things got very political again. So it's probably had its most protracted political moment ever. In terms of art being, since modern art began, we have this protracted period of reflection on political art, and it doesn't work because the art world is so tied into finance. And you really feel that. You feel that the statements are very superficial. So
Yeah.
it's a process of whitewashing the egos of collectors, of art collectors. So getting away from that, because you want me to talk about memes, no, I would say that memes, that's where they maybe step in, that you have this situation where the art world kind of presents itself as the area of counterculture, the place where, alternative thought might thrive. This is why people go to art school. Then you go there and you start to realize that actually it's not here at all. I've been given courses on how to appeal to a gallerist, and no one has time for me because they're
Successfully as well. I think that's the
yeah,
biggest crime of the art school in my estimation. But
yeah,
never mind that.
yeah. I mean, art school is deeply disappointing for many people,
Yeah.
and I see the problem that problem being associated generally just with the art world as a market. So art school reflects that, and it kills people's dreams in a way that's reflective of the way that the dream of art has been killed for society. So under a capitalist culture, there isn't this space of rebellion, but there is a space online where anyone can go and do anything. So you can't maybe do anything in art school, and you can't do anything if you want to succeed in the art world, but you can do anything in the meme sphere. This is again where the internet is the best and worst of all things, because you can get you get people doing anything, and then they do these quite nasty things, and you get people doing anything and they do wonderful things, and then the whole mass of everything put together is like a mass. It's such a confusion. It's like reading James Joyce or something. But that's where it works in a way. You do get an abstraction through the internet. The internet is an
Yeah.
abstraction because you can't make sense of it, and that not being able to make sense may throw up some new ideas, because you have, the human mind has to try and make sense, or we don't make any sense, and then we get suspended in some moment of, where we're not making judgments. But that would also be good. But yeah, I think there is some kind of potential there, but I don't think it's very fulfilling if people want to know, like, how are we gonna solve the big problems we have now. I don't think they're going to be convinced that the internet will do that. But then, one has to wonder, are we just in this maelstrom because everything's being thrown up in the air so people can put any message out there? It's causing widespread confusion. We don't really know where we're heading next. And do we just have to wait till the pieces land back in place? I don't know. But in terms of, what do memes do that's better than the art world or better than mass media? Well, I mean, anyone can make anything. Anyone can publish anything. I mean, this is already huge. This is already, in terms of power, the complaints that were being made by the Frankfurt School and by media theorists of the whole of the last century. It's all top down. It's all coming from the elite down. The same voices are being heard again and again. That's completely collapsed. And there are so many more theorists that, for me to have a voice as a theorist, anything like, some of the people we look back to, like Baudrillard or Debord, Guy Debord, etc., it's just not possible. But I think, you have to stand in awe and say, well, this is the thing we always wanted. And, I give an example that when I go online, I get cussed out. I get people criticizing me, and they're not evidently people who hold PhDs in the subject. They might be 20 years old, often they are.
Yeah.
And, you have to kind of think, how am I going to deal with that? sometimes your level of expertise doesn't matter. Sometimes they know what you do and they make fun of you or something. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen. And I'm not talking about the very nasty stuff when people are actually out to cancel you. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, I actually look on in awe, and I'm like, something's been achieved because I'm being cussed out by effectively my students, even if they're not sometimes my actual students, but people of that age. Because back in the day, like when Mark Fisher had K-Punk, the reason his K-Punk blog got so popular, one reason, and the same as Graham Harman's blog, which is still ongoing, and a number of other blogs. There was Speculative Heresy from Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams. Nina Power had a blog. There was this moment, this explosion in theory blogging. The reason why that caught on is because nobody could talk to their own professor. I was at the CRMEP, Centre for Research into Modern European Philosophy, doing my master's. And you couldn't access, I mean, Ray Brassier was very good. Alex Duttman was relatively accessible. But often you felt that, you weren't supposed to really talk to your professors. You wrote emails, you were told to come and see them in the 1 hour or 2 hours of office time they had that week. And this was reflective across academia. But you could reach out through the comments section to Mark Fisher, or you could email him and he'd reply, and Graham Harman and a number of other people. So this broke down that hierarchy, but not entirely, because it was still very much that there were a few leaders, that you could reach out to these people, but you very much felt that they were still the philosophers. Now it's like, in a way, it's what's happened to theory. It's like what happened to art. Anyone can be an artist. And I think we very much buy into that. Art is something that anyone should be able to do. The kind of sense of there being experts is being eroded to a large degree. In the contemporary art world, the art market, you still have that. That has to be in place for the market to work. But generally, we're open to calling many things art now. That's happening more and more to theory. And then, you look at some stupid memes, a stupid meme that, maybe takes the Mark Fisher quote out of context. And you can think, well, is this right? But at the same time, you can think, well, at least it's creating conversation, it's getting people to think. A lot of people are looking, they're buying Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. Is it 87 pages?
I'd say it's a very, very punchy way to deliver a very depressing message.
Yeah, and they're reading it, and and then they're maybe taking the depressive message away and not taking the kind of positive aspects away. But I don't know. I think there's still room for positivity, and I think partly evidenced by the fact that people attack you if you write about memes in academia. Some people do, and you just know that therefore it must be doing something good because they fear memes, they fear online culture.
Yeah, I've had a couple of encounters with media theorists who are completely appalled by any suggestions that one would engage with the study of Pepe the Frog and try to figure out what it all means and try to find, as you do in a book, alternatives for other political outlooks. So you talked about the difficulties and rather the challenge of the impossibility of just appropriating right-wing techniques. And in the book, you discuss Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, who at some point had this kind of super progressive platform that include universal basic income. Somehow within his movement, there was this idea that he could get ahead by getting tagged on to the meme movement. And you describe this utterly bizarre moment when his campaign team tried to make him into a kind of Pepper the Frog meme. And this is, of course, an illustration of a failure. I want to tell you an anecdote, something that I experienced merely a week ago at the opening of Venice Biennale. I was sitting at dinner next to a very young, I guess, an anarcho-communist who lives in Rome, who displayed his leftist credentials in a way that left me absolutely no doubt as to his convictions and his deeply anti-right-wing politics. And he kept on talking and eventually started singing. He kept on talking about how him and his comrades occasionally do things like sing Italian fascist songs from the 1930s, precisely as a means of appropriation. So it's kind of a strategy there. I wasn't able to really process what it is that he was trying to get at, and it was a little bit difficult to deal with when he started actually singing fascist songs at dinner. But never mind, it was late. But I could see some kind of potential in this kind of endless sarcasm of the kind of counterculture production that the meme the meme engages then. So I'd like to offer you
Yeah,
that as a kind of counterpoint case study to the failure of Andrew Young's attempt to appropriate right wing culture.
I mean, a couple of things there. Firstly, I do know that Italians that they do appropriate fascist icons and images in their artwork, often to make a left wing point. That it's
Mm.
something that where it just wouldn't be done in the UK or the US,
Mm.
or there would be uproar if it was done. That it's kind of it's just it's taken as normal there. I think partly because you have to bear in mind that a lot of the fascist architecture is in place. The
Yeah.
National Football Stadium has obelisk to Mussolini just outside it.
Mm.
This modernist obelisk with Duce or Dux written on the front, which means Duce, Führer, basically. They're still living alongside these things. It's not so much a situation of having completely disowned their past, because I suppose that they kind of capitulated. They kind of they changed sides, didn't they? Well, not so much that they changed sides in World War II, but that they had a strong partisan movement that
Yeah.
themselves did away with Mussolini. So it's not quite the same situation as Germany
Hmm.
or Japan. But as for the Andrew Yang, well, he basically, as you say, he offered his universal basic income, and what happened is that suddenly there were a lot of memes circulating that appeared to be possibly from the same people who had been making previously pro-Trump memes, who become disillusioned with Trump, and who basically said, like, yeah, let's have the €1,000 a month, sorry, $1,000 a month universal basic income, and they started making memes in which they would take the money and sell it and spend it on drugs or spend it on drinking
Hmm.
or whatever. So it was just it was really just kind of a joke around that. But they did infuse these images with Pepe the Frog and with Wojak characters, so crudely drawn, line drawn characters that have been familiar from Trump's campaign, from the memes associated with that. So I think this was the primary issue, and not so much that Yang co-opted these images, such as Pepe the Frog, more that people appended these images to his campaign, and he would have had a hard time shaking this off. So I think I don't know what he himself did, but his campaign group kind of went along with it. They were aware that this massively increased visibility of Yang's campaign. The issue there is more, Yang, in a sense, being derailed. That his campaign, which was only partly about universal basic income, even though he did kind of put that at the front of his campaign, became this kind of silly joke around MAGA hat wearing pro Trumpers suddenly ditching the hat in return for $1,000 a month. This was a popular
Yeah.
meme trope. So you might have, for example, actually Pepe the Frog, you know, going over to Yang. So my feeling was that more that that there's something impressive about the way that meme creators can overturn the kind of mainstream messaging of a Democratic candidate. I wasn't so much taken up by the fact that a left wing message had been tampered with. I'd rather that it hadn't have happened, in a sense. But the kind of the positivity, if there is anything positive about this, resides in the way that young people making memes in their bedrooms can mess with well-funded political campaigns, and that could have a positive value. But the thing is, the left haven't seemed to work out how to do this in the same way.
Mm. I want to take us back to, again, the role of counterculture, which we have been mentioning on and off. I think it would be remiss of me not to ask you to deliver a manifesto for what Mark Fisher referred to as acid communism, and you call, maybe for slightly marketing reasons, you call acid leftism. Particularly, I'm interested in how you see the potential of counterculture as a political tool.
Well, let's just go dial back a bit. For example, there's this meme called "We fucking on the Fisher bed tonight." Okay, it comes from a series of memes which are called, "We are fucking on the like X bed tonight," where X could be the Minecraft bed, or it could be
Yeah.
whatever bed. But inevitably, perhaps a meme was produced in which there was a picture of a bed with the cover of Fisher's Capitalist Realism as a bedspread. This obviously is kind of ridiculous. And it shows to what degree Mark Fisher's image has been kind of turned around and tampered with, that you can't get to the serious nature of the book, so easily, because you're dealing with that kind of bizarre meme. Bizarre partly because Fisher was such a kind of, self-effacive, quiet guy that the message, like, we're fucking on the Fisher bed, just seems, it seems unusual to anyone who had met him or had seen him talk ever. What I say in the book is that, look, there may be somewhere a real life doomer, and then we get to actually the doomer is a type of meme. It's like a generic depressed person. Yeah.
Again, links to all of this in the show notes for listeners who might want to get addicted.
Somewhere there may be a real life doomer somewhere sitting on a capitalist realism bedspread and contemplating revolution. So you see how this kind of comes about. That it's all ridiculous, but somebody might get pulled into this through these memes, and they may actually decide to somehow work through this and work out how to bring about democratic socialism, for example. And then as well as Doomer, you have Doomer Girl, you have like your various different meme figures, because you mentioned Doomer and Doomer Girl earlier, we haven't mentioned them. So anyhow, in a similar way, Mark Fisher argues that somehow out of all of this kind of, out of the mess we're in, there may emerge a counter-cultural movement, which he would call acid communism, or more to the point, he states we need an acid communism. Now, an acid communism for Fisher is a movement which kind of blends the basic message of communism, let's say what I said earlier, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, that blends that with a creative movement in the mold of 60s and 70s psychedelia. Now, what Fisher found important about 60s and 70s psychedelia is that it wasn't something that just happened like in Woodstock or in fields somewhere or in, parties in fashionable parts of London, or, even when it became a much bigger movement. It's not something that just happened amongst young people who dropped acid, basically. Psychedelic culture was, it was infused throughout even mainstream culture. You had TV programs that were totally off the wall in the 60s. You had constant psychedelic music playing on the radio. That there was a sense of the blurring of boundaries that comes about through psychedelia. And a sense of this blurring of boundaries, this kind of losing one's edges, that pervaded throughout society at that moment, partly because you also had a kind of gender and sexual revolution, and you also had a questioning of the class system, and you had a potentiality because it seemed that the West was booming somehow economically, or at points in the 60s and 70s it was, and maybe the whole system could be subverted. Fisher says that perhaps we could have that moment again, or rather we need to have that moment again. And really, he sees the acid as a corrective to the overly kind of officious and power-driven hierarchical tendencies of traditional Marxism or traditional communism. So you have this thing where, in a way, the acid is a corrective to the problems of totalitarianism and the way communism is perceived. But then communism is a corrective to the LSD, because when people think of LSD, they think of people losing their heads and talking drivel, and also having wonderful spiritual encounters and things, but things that maybe can't be useful, to creating the conditions of socialism. I don't actually, I'm not involved anymore, but I ran a YouTube channel and podcast called The Acid Left with a poet and artist called Adam Ray Adkins. I actually removed myself, not for really any specific reason. I suppose one thing is that the issue of hallucinogens came up constantly. And I think this is interesting. I actually thought this yesterday, and I said it to somebody. I haven't said it publicly at all. But I think Mark Fisher would have really been in trouble. I mean, not big trouble, not more trouble than he'd known before, because he got in trouble with Twitter trolls and things before. But he would certainly have had problems, with this term acid communism. He would have been constantly asked about the psychedelic connotations, and should one drop LSD? And I assume Fisher wasn't doing drugs in his last years. I certainly don't think it was imperative that one does LSD. Fisher was very much more talking about the pervasiveness of psychedelia in culture in general at the time. But yeah, I mean, the movement he proposes is basically is that we need a movement of music events, but also seminars where we can discuss things openly, and where we can build communities. And I think the argument at the end of my book is that we can use the internet to foster that movement. So we have this opportunity with online culture to meet up outside. So you're making a podcast, I make podcasts. Now I run a podcast called Down and Out in the Art World, but also I have a new YouTube channel called Theory Wave Nights. It's actually an old channel I reclaimed, Theory Wave Nights. But the frustrating thing when you're involved in these things is that we have this massive online left now who make memes, podcasts, videos, etc. But we haven't worked out how to kind of get that out on the streets. But I think the Bernie Sanders and Corbyn campaigns kind of demonstrated how that's possible, because you had quite advanced online database type systems where you would go in and you would be told, oh, we need some street canvassers in Hackney tomorrow in London. We need some more memes on this subject. We need this. We need So they were coordinating people both online and offline through this online system. And I think, why couldn't we do that outside the electoral moment? Because, that was kind of an exciting moment. It was momentum that were managing that kind of software. The Sanders campaign managed it directly. It was called something like dispersed organisation. It's this method of organising, where you would kind of organise centrally online, but have people sent out doing different things. And you would say to people, please go canvassing this week once, but also make a meme or a tweet about this, So, we can have both things existing concurrently. But the thing is, they happen during election. This happens during election campaigns, then it stops. But what if we had that database all the time?
I mean, I think this is a very important question, because I think one of the failures of the left that I'm receptive to, or at least critiques of the left now, is that it has completely lost its ability to develop infrastructure. And in the 21st century, where everything is online, where the right-wing campaigns are all perfectly synchronized to big data, that this kind of infrastructure development is pretty important.
Yeah, I think I think you would need you'd need to be a campaign as such, but maybe just an interim campaign between elections, or maybe I don't know. We have a problem. I think we need to subordinate the elections to the movement. So that's why I think we need this kind of thing happening all the time. But I mean, no doubt momentum. I mean, of course, they're still doing big things, and the Sanders campaign is kind of ongoing as well. But I think it could be rolled out. Because I think it could be rolled out and become a bigger, continuous thing. You could say, let's have some kind of street action in Helsinki whilst we have a street action in London, and let's also have a podcast on this and that. I mean, we could coordinate things much more closely between street events and online events on a constant basis.
Well, you just have to convince these armies of meme makers, artists, and activists to join the cause. Mike, to finish, I have probably the most meta question I've ever been able to ask here, because I understand that your book and you got memed almost in the manner of Mark Fisher.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the memeing of Mark Fisher before it came out, 2 weeks before it came out, it actually it became a kind of meme because somebody else released a book by the same name deliberately to try and derail my book. And actually, it was a book just simply full of memes of Mark Fisher, some of which were made by me actually, that they pulled off Instagram. And it was kind of a cynical move, but I could see how it was kind of funny as well. It didn't impede the book. The book actually did very well. It may actually have increased the book sales, but it's followed upon hundreds of tweets against the book a few months before that, when a number of people associated with a rival publisher saw the title and just took umbrage. Firstly, that I wrote a book about about Mark Fisher. Secondly, that I wrote a book about memes and Mark Fisher. There were all kinds of reasons, but there were some quite ridiculous oppositions. But the interesting thing, I mean, I don't know how much I should really go into this, but with a spoof book of my book, which still exists on Amazon, you can still see it there. It seems to have had some links to somebody who actually endorsed my book, and there will be a second edition of my book, and it will be well publicized with a preface on all these kind of strange strands that occurred around the release of my book. So this maybe will be raised again. All the craziness around the book will resurface when I release the second edition, probably with, well, not with Zero Books. It'll be with a new publisher, but I'll get into that. I'll reveal that soon.
Yeah, I mean, for listeners who might have spent some time online and are privy to the ins and outs of the online left, Zero Books has also gone through a, let's put it mildly, a meme moment recently as well. But maybe that's enough controversy for one day. Mike, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a pleasure to gain an insight into the dark online left and a bit of the dark online right.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Thanks. It's been great to be here. Thank you.
The Memeing of Mark Fisher, How the Frankfurt School Foresaw Capitalist Realism and What to Do About It by Mike Watson is published by Zero Books. I'm Pierre Valença, and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening, and join us next time.